I'll do anything to be your wife.
The torches burned high against the night sky, their smoke curling into the wind. James Rylan was shoved forward, his boots dragging against the dirt as alien warriors surrounded him. Their armor clinked like steel scales, their eyes sharp and suspicious, glowing faintly in the firelight. Rows of towering tents loomed ahead, marked with banners of crimson and silver, the symbols of a people he did not know but instantly feared. He had seen battles before, wrecked ships, broken engines, the aftermath of war, but never like this. Here, the air itself carried the weight of blood and pride. Hundreds of alien warriors stood in silence as he was dragged into their midst, their gazes piercing into him as though trying to measure his worth. James felt like prey surrounded by predators. Then the crowd shifted, and she appeared. The alien commander stepped forward with a presence that silenced the camp. Her armor shimmered like molten silver, fitted to her tall and commanding form. Flowing black hair spilled behind her, and her violet eyes glowed with an authority that made even her soldiers lower their heads. She carried her blade at her hip with the ease of someone who had wielded it 1,000 times before. She did not stop until she stood directly before him. In one motion she drew her weapon and raised it, the edge catching the firelight as it pointed at his chest. James froze. The entire camp seemed to hold its breath. Her voice rang out, sharp and clear, carrying to every ear around them. "I will do anything to be your wife, human." For a moment, nothing moved. The warriors blinked in disbelief, their whispers rising like a storm. A vow like this, from a commander of the scifi, was no casual thing. And to direct it toward a human, it was madness. Yet her blade did not tremble, and her violet eyes never left his. James felt his pulse thunder in his ears. He wanted to speak, to ask what this meant, but the words died on his tongue. The camp roared with shock and fury, but the commander stood unyielding, her vow hanging in the firelit air like a blade suspended between worlds. The uproar spread through the crowd like fire on dry grass. Some warriors shouted in their own tongue, voices full of disbelief. Others laughed bitterly, mocking the very idea that their proud commander would bind herself to a fragile human. A few stared in silence, their expressions hard to read, but all eyes returned to the woman with the blade. James stood frozen, his mouth dry. The weapon at his chest did not move, yet it was her words, not the steel, that held him captive. He had no idea what she meant. Marriage? Loyalty? Why him? The commander lowered her blade at last, though her stance remained as rigid as stone. With a flick of her hand, she ordered her lieutenants forward. 2 of them, armored and broad-shouldered, stepped to James's side and guided him, not roughly this time, but with the precision of guards escorting someone important. They brought him into the largest tent, its entrance draped with banners marked in silver glyphs. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with incense. Strange lamps burned with violet flame, casting shadows on walls lined with weapons and maps. A round table stood at the center, surrounded by tall, grim warriors. James was shoved into a seat, his heart still pounding. One of the lieutenants leaned close. His voice was low, his words careful, as if he struggled to shape them into the human tongue. "You must understand, human. The vow of the commander is not spoken lightly. To the scifi, such words are eternal. Marriage is not a union of comfort. It is loyalty beyond death, a bond of strength and trust that cannot be broken." James stared at him, struggling to believe. Eternal? Unbreakable? He shook his head. "There must be some mistake. She cannot mean me." The lieutenant's violet eyes hardened. "She does." The tent grew quiet as the commander herself stepped forward, her armor whispering with each motion. She dismissed the others with a sharp gesture, and soon only James and she remained. The silence between them pressed heavily until she spoke. "I saw you before the campfire, alone, surrounded by my warriors, yet you did not tremble. You looked at me as though I were flesh and blood, not a god of war." Her voice softened, though her eyes stayed sharp. "Courage lives in you, human. Courage different from mine. That is why I chose you." James's chest tightened. Courage? He wanted to laugh. He was no warrior. He was a mechanic, a drifter who mended broken things. He had only stood still because fear had numbed his legs. Yet the way she spoke left no room for mockery. She believed it. She believed in him. Her intensity unsettled him. She moved closer, her blade now sheathed, her presence overwhelming. Among my people, this vow binds me. My soldiers will test me, mock me, perhaps betray me. But I will not break. I have spoken the words, and they are truth. James swallowed hard. He felt the heat of her nearness, the weight of her gaze. Why risk so much for someone like me? Her lips curved, not in a smile but in something fiercer. Because I see what they do not, and I do not mistake strength for armor or muscle. You are steady, human, and steadiness is rarer than steel. Her words echoed in the dim firelight, leaving James caught between disbelief and something deeper, a stirring he did not yet understand. The next morning, the camp was alive with unrest. Word of Soraya's vow had spread like lightning, and the warriors of the Zyri were not quiet in their opinions. James felt the weight of their stares as he was escorted through the rows of tents. Some looked at him with open contempt, others with mocking grins, and a few with genuine curiosity. But none looked at him with respect. He understood why. To them he was small, fragile, unworthy of their commander. And Soraya, towering, unbending, a warrior carved from steel, had bound herself to him. The insult to their pride demanded an answer. The first challenge came before the sun had fully risen. A rival commander stepped into the central grounds, his armor dark with crimson markings. His voice boomed across the camp. If our leader has chosen a weakling for her mate, then she has lost her edge. Let her prove her strength against me, or surrender her place. The crowd roared with approval, the warriors stamping their feet against the ground. James stood at the edge, his stomach sinking. He had no choice but to watch as Soraya strode into the circle, her blade gleaming in the firelight. The duel began with no ceremony. The rival struck first, his weapon slicing through the air with lethal speed. But Soraya met his strike with a ringing clash, her movements sharp and precise. She fought not like someone defending her pride, but like a storm, each motion carrying the weight of unshakable conviction. The crowd shouted with every clash of steel. James's fists clenched at his sides as sparks flew. He had no words for what he saw. Soraya was fierce and graceful, her blade an extension of her very being. But he also saw the risk. Every strike, every dodge brought her closer to danger. And it was all for him. The duel ended in a blur. Soraya caught her rival's blade, twisted, and drove him to the ground with her weapon at his throat. The silence was instant. When she stepped back and let him live, the message was clear. Her vow had not weakened her. If anything, it had sharpened her edge. But that was only the first. Day after day, new challengers rose. Some were desperate for her command, others only wanted to shame her. Each time, Soraya fought. Each time, James stood in the crowd, helpless, watching the woman who had claimed him risk her life again and again. Between battles, he found himself at her side. In the dim quiet of her tent, he would clean her wounds with trembling hands, his fingers brushing against her skin where her armor had failed to protect. She never flinched under his touch. If anything, her gaze softened in those moments, as if his care meant more than any victory. One evening, after she had defeated her third challenger, James pressed a cloth to the cut along her shoulder. His voice was low, unsteady. You should not have to do this. Not for me. Soraya studied him in silence, her violet eyes reflecting the firelight. Then she lifted her hand and covered his, holding it against her wound. I will fight for you until no one dares to question my vow. That is my choice, human, not yours. James had no reply. He only felt the steady pressure of her hand against his, and the strange warmth that spread through him despite the fear. The duels did not end, but their rhythm became the heartbeat of the camp. Every few days another challenger stepped forward, and every time Soraya's blade sang louder than their doubts. Yet it was not the clashing steel that lingered in James's mind. It was the quiet that followed, the moments when she allowed herself to set her weapon aside and become something more than a commander. One night, after the campfires had dimmed and most of the warriors had retired to their tents, James found himself alone with her in her war tent. The air was heavy with the scent of burning incense and the low crackle of a brazier casting warm light across the space. Her armor lay discarded to the side, its polished plates resting against a rack. For the first time, he saw her without it, clothed only in a dark, flowing garment that softened her edges. She lowered herself to sit beside him, closer than she had ever been. The violet flames flickered against her features, highlighting not the warrior, but the woman beneath. Her voice, usually so sharp and commanding, was low and thoughtful. "You humans?" she began, brushing a strand of black hair behind her ear. "You value things differently, not just strength or victory. There is something in you I do not understand. You laugh even when the world is cruel. You cling to memories instead of battles." James hesitated, unsure how to answer. Then he reached into his pack and pulled out something small, something he had carried through every journey. A battered music device, scratched and nearly broken, but still able to play. With a soft click, he set it on the table between them, and the tent filled with the faint sound of a human melody. The notes were gentle, drifting like wind over water. Soraya's violet eyes widened. She leaned closer, her fingers hovering just above the device, as though touching it might break the spell. "This is not a weapon, not a tool. What is it for?" James smiled faintly. "It is just music, a reminder of home, of people, of moments worth remembering." She listened in silence, her chest rising and falling with each breath. The sharp edge of her presence seemed to soften. Slowly, she let her fingers brush against his hand where it rested on the table. Her touch was tentative, almost shy, as though testing a boundary she had never crossed before. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I do not want only your loyalty, James Rylan. I want your heart. I want to know what it means to be chosen, not just to choose." His throat tightened. He had no words ready for her, no defenses against the raw honesty in her eyes. The camp outside was filled with suspicion and mockery, but here, in the flickering firelight, there was only her hand against his, her gaze searching his face for something he was afraid to admit. And in that moment, James realized that the battles she fought were not just with her blade. They were with her heart, her pride, and her fear of losing what she had found in him. The peace of the stolen moment did not last. The more Soraya's vow held, the more bitter her rivals became. Whispers turned into schemes, and one night those schemes bled into action. James had been lying awake in his tent on the camp's edge, the faint hum of alien voices drifting through the night. His thoughts circled endlessly around Soraya, her vow, her battles, her touch in the firelight. He was almost drifting into sleep when a sound tore him from his thoughts. The soft scrape of metal, too deliberate to be an accident. He sat up. A shadow moved at the entrance, then another. Before he could call out, the flap of the tent lifted, and two figures slipped inside. Their blades gleamed faintly in the moonlight, curved and wicked, aimed directly at him. His breath caught. "Wait!" The first lunged, but before the strike could fall, a roar cut through the air. Soraya burst through the tent flap, her silver blade flashing like lightning. The clash of steel rang in the darkness as she intercepted the assassin's strike and drove him back. The second attacker turned toward James, but Soraya moved faster, her weapon carving a deadly arc that forced him to stumble. The fight was over in heartbeats. Both attackers fell, their weapons clattering to the dirt. Soraya stood above them, her chest heaving, her armor stained with blood. Her violet eyes blazed as she looked down at their still forms, then turned sharply to James. "They would have killed you," she said, her voice trembling. Not with fear, but with fury. She stepped closer, her hand gripping his arm as though to assure herself he was still there. "You are mine. No one touches you. No one takes you from me." James could not find his voice. His heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear her words. The tent smelled of blood and steel, the air sharp with the aftermath of violence. Yet her hand on his arm was steady, and the fire in her eyes was not the cold rage of a commander. It was the desperate fear of someone who had almost lost what mattered most. "Soraya," he managed at last. I do not know how to be what you want." Her grip tightened. For the first time since he had met her, her voice wavered. "I want only you. Not your strength, not your victories. You, do you not see? Cannot lose you. I will not." Before he could answer, she pulled him close and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was fierce, desperate, tasting of fire and blood. Her armor was cold beneath his hands, but her body trembled as though the weight of her vow was breaking her from within. When she pulled back, her forehead rested against his, her breath ragged. "You are not my weakness, James Rylan. You are my strength, the fire that sharpens my blade. And I swear, I will cut down anyone who dares to call you less than mine." For the first time, James felt the walls inside him crack. He could no longer pretend her devotion was just ritual or pride. Her heart was laid bare before him, and he felt the truth of it echo in his own chest. The assassination attempt changed everything. No longer was Soraya's vow seen as a strange folly or a commander's reckless whim. It had become a battle line dividing the camp. Some warriors whispered that she had grown stronger with the human at her side. Others spat that she had grown weak, poisoned by affection. Tension hung over the camp like a storm about to break. That storm came sooner than expected. On the morning of the 7th day, Soraya's greatest rival stepped forward. Commander Varen, a towering figure clad in black armor carved with jagged crimson markings, entered the dueling grounds with a challenge that thundered through the air. "Soraya of the Silver Blade, you have bound yourself to a fragile outsider, and in doing so you have dishonored us all. Today, I strip you of your command, or I strip you of your life." The crowd erupted, warriors pounding their weapons against their shields in savage rhythm. All eyes turned to Soraya as she stepped into the circle. Her armor shone bright beneath the rising sun, her blade already drawn. There was no hesitation in her stride, no fear in her eyes. James stood at the edge of the circle, his throat tight. He had seen her fight many times now, but this was different. Varen was no challenger seeking glory. He was a predator, and he fought with the weight of the camp behind him. The duel began with a clash that shook the air. Varen's strikes were brutal, each one designed to break, to overwhelm, to crush. Soraya met him blow for blow, her movements fluid yet unyielding. Sparks leapt from every strike, the sound of steel echoing like thunder across the camp. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Sweat beaded on Soraya's brow, her breathing ragged but steady. Varen pressed harder, his blade carving the air with savage force. He drove her back step by step, the ground darkening with blood where shallow cuts had marked her skin. James's fists clenched. He could not move, could not interfere, yet every fiber of his being screamed to rush to her side. Still, she did not falter. Her violet eyes blazed brighter with every strike, not dimming, not breaking. And then an opening. With a sudden twist, Soraya caught Varen's blade, turned his momentum against him, and drove her weapon across his chest in a single, decisive arc. The sound of steel tearing armor split the air. Varen fell to his knees, blood staining the dirt beneath him. The camp went silent. Soraya stood tall, her chest rising with every heavy breath, her blade pointed at her rival's throat. But she did not finish him. Instead, she stepped back, letting her weapon fall to her side. Her victory was undeniable. The silence broke into a roar. Some cheered, others cursed, but none could deny the truth. She had won. Her vow had not broken her. It had made her unstoppable. James's heart pounded. Something inside him shifted, snapping free of the chains he had wrapped around it. Before he could stop himself, he stepped forward, into the dueling circle. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the human walked toward their commander. Soraya turned, surprise flickering in her eyes as he approached. He stopped before her, his voice steady despite the thunder of his pulse. Soraya. She blinked, her blade lowering. James. Before all her warriors, before the banners of her people, James reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were warm, trembling slightly from battle, but she did not pull away. He met her gaze, violet fire reflecting against the storm of his own heart. Yes, he whispered, I will be your husband. The camp erupted in disbelief. Warriors shouted, some in outrage, others in awe. But none of it mattered. In that moment, the mechanic and the commander stood together, bound not by ritual or politics, but by choice, by love. Soraya's lips parted, her eyes shining as though she had been waiting for those words longer than she had waited for any victory. She squeezed his hand, her voice fierce and unshaken. Then let the stars bear witness. We are one. Together they stood at the center of the circle, husband and wife. A mechanic who had thought himself ordinary, and a warrior who had chosen him above empires. Their bond was stronger than steel, sharper than any blade, and destined to carve a new path through the stars. And for the first time, James Ryland did not feel like a drifter or a wanderer. He felt like he belonged, at her side, forever.